Hello, and welcome to the Angus and Pete Show. Views and opinions are strictly those of the presenters and their guests and should not be taken as advice. Goodness knows, we're not qualified to advise you about anything. Side effects may include mild amusement and occasional enlightenment with feelings of embarrassment, apathy, disappointment, and pity.
Welcome to episode 6. I'm Angus Pacey.
And I'm Pete Brown, and we are the Angus and Pete Show.
This is the place where you can listen to two guys chatting about that riveting world of customer engagement.
Riveting world of customer engagement, aka call center, contact center, customer service, customer experience, CX. You know.
If you want to find more about us, check us out on LinkedIn.
So, Angus, what's in the postbag?
Manuel from Barcelona. He was quite happy with RFP part 1. Says he wants to know more about the different roles that are involved in drafting and responding to RFPs. So, really about what goes on the seller side.
Okay.
And then we had Kim from Falkirk. I assume that's the Falkirk up in Scotland.
I would think so. I'm not aware of another one.
Never been there. But Kim wants to know, how do I limit the number of people I issue my RFP to without missing the right supplier? That's an interesting one.
In fact, both of those, Manuel and Kim, I think we're going to address your issues in this episode and maybe in the follow-up episode. So listen in, both those questions will be answered.
Yeah, I think that spans both sellers and buyers.
Yeah.
Carla from Uppsala. Now, I'm assuming that is somewhere in the Nordics.
I think that's in Sweden, Angus.
Yeah, never been there either. So I need to do some more traveling. What is the strangest thing you've ever seen in an RFP process?
Wow.
Now, quite a few.
Do you know what? Well, I'm going to have a think about that. Why don't you take it away?
I've got one that happened a good couple of years ago where we issued an RFP. We were looking for a new platform and had gone through the entire process of down selecting 3 vendors that we then got in for detailed presentations from them with a whole panel that was very senior. It went swimmingly well until we asked one commercial question. And the vendor that was presenting, part of their presentation team were the 2 founders of the organization. Now, you would imagine normally when you've got 2 founders of the organization that they would be in sync. However, what became very clear very fast that these 2 were absolutely not on the same page and actually had a stand-up row in the presentation between the 2 of them, while the rest of the panel sat there absolutely gobsmacked.
Did they win? Did they get the business?
No, and a bit of guidance to anybody participating in a presentation team. Do not have a row, because that resulted in an instant cross out of them on that short list of 3. So it helped us. We got to a short list of 2 really quickly.
Okay. Do you know what? I can talk about some bizarre questions that I've had in RFPs. These are real questions. First one was, how many ping pong balls can you get in a standard sized shipping container?
No, that's an interview question. There is no way.
That was an RFP question. I gave it to one of our software guys who did the measurements and wrote a little bit of code, and we came up with an answer. And then we went to the first meeting, which was a run through the RFP response, question by question. And we got to this question and we said, how did we do? And they said, well, you were over by quite a long way. We asked them what was the correct answer. They told us. We went back and told our software guy, who was gutted. And then he came back and said, you know what? I think they've used the minimum dimensions of a standard shipping container and not taken into consideration the corrugations that they have on the side of a shipping container for strength. Do you know this? Right. So when we did our presentation to them, we had a slide about this question, and we said, look, we think you got it wrong. You asked the right question, but there was not enough context. And this is actually the answer. and they loved it. Now, actually, we didn't win that deal, but it was a good bit of fun. The other question I had, and we did win, was if your support organisation was an animal, what animal would it be? So we agreed on dolphin, and our support organisation was like a dolphin because it was intelligent, smooth, agile, and always turned up with a massive smile on its face, regardless of how choppy the waters were. Great answer. Anyway, Carla, I hope that's giving you a little bit of inspiration for some of the answers that you give to your questions. And I guess, Angus, we need to move on to the meat of this episode.
And you actually gave us a perfect segue in part of your answer, which was about context. And we'll definitely come to that. So everybody listening to this episode hopefully has listened to RFP Part 1. If you haven't, I suggest you quickly pause this episode and go listen to that one, because that sets the context for this one. In this episode, we're going to really focus on how buyers can run an effective and efficient RFP process, because there are two sides to this game.
Yeah.
And let's look at buyers carefully and see what some of the good do's and don'ts are, and give some tips and tricks.
Okay. So in part 1, we frame this thing as RFP, a real fucking problem. And I guess in part 2, we're going to frame this thing as the right fucking process.
Yeah,
would you agree with that, Angus?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of framing this one.
Good. We don't like gratuitous language, but there's a time and a place for it. The first thing that I think buyers need to remember is that they are really selling this opportunity to potential suppliers. There is much on show in terms of organisation and professionalism and all those other things as they would expect any seller to be. And I think that a lot of buyers forget that. A lot of buyers forget that they have a persuasion job to do, and they need to look like an attractive proposition.
When you are writing and working out what the content is and what you're going to put into your RFP document, put in the back of your mind that somebody reading that must get the impression that you know what you are talking about.
Yeah.
Because if it looks like a load of bollocks, they're going to go, I don't think I want to deal with this company.
Exactly. And you know what? Something else, never mind about this RFP. If you have issued RFPs in the past, sellers have long memories. Sellers move around to different organisations, and they'll judge you by your previous performances. Some organisations, buying organisations, have got a reputation. Be very difficult, very hard work, and I think that reputation may limit the effectiveness of some of their procurement processes. So remember, as a buyer, that you're a seller too.
Yeah,
you just
really,
need to sell
really
yourself,
important.
and you need to be effective. Yeah, Angus, you spoke about context earlier on. That brings us on to the second point, which is whatever you're doing, be precise about what it is you want, but give it context. And what I mean by that is be very precise about the outcomes and the goals that you're looking to achieve as a result of this RFP and a result of what you end up buying.
I think what's important is that ultimately, if you think about the decision, it's driven by a business case. That's what the execs are going to look like. So you've got to be really clear on what your outcomes are.
Yeah.
And what success looks like. So what are you trying to achieve? What does success look like? Why do you need the answers from this RFP to be succinct and accurate?
Yeah.
Because you've got to absolutely understand what the problem is you're trying to solve, and you've got to be able to articulate that for the people that are trying to answer this for you. Because if you don't have a very succinct problem, they cannot come back with a succinct answer. And if you've got those two correct, then it should allow them to be very clear in their answers and also articulate what the benefits are of going with them.
So context is important. There's also a place for being very specific when it comes to requesting information.
Yeah, you've got to know why you've got to know why you are asking. But I
Right.
think that the next thing going into that, this is not one way. This is not one way traffic. This is not write it down in a document and then hand it to people and then hope that they're going to know what you are trying to achieve. So if you think about it, Pete, you must have seen this as well. You must have seen good and bad. What does that, how should that dialogue look?
Do you know what? I think even if you haven't formulated your ideas, even if you're not ready to document them, even if you haven't got this, RFP, request for proposal, ready to go, get engaged with vendors. Put a bit of structure around it. Have some meetings just to find out what's going on. Get engaged early. Doesn't have to be formal dialogue. Even take up references early, things of that sort. Just go and find out what these vendors are doing. Build your relationships, because as soon as the procurement process comes along and starts to formalize things, you have to sort of limit that. You have formality of the buying process often stifles any conversation, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful for the sellers, and it's certainly not helpful for the buyers. They don't get the best out of it.
Well, all the procurement processes that I've seen almost gag everybody that's going to be involved with the evaluations from actually talking to any of the respondents. So do this up front. But I think there's another benefit to this. If you have that discussion, you will be able to very quickly identify who you don't want to issue the RFP to, so that you don't send it to everybody. But also recognize that other parts of the organization that you may not anticipate are going to be talking to sellers.
Right.
This is real. When, if you're in IT and you've been given the responsibility to go and do the RFP and frame everything for this, bet your bottom dollar there are business users and business stakeholders that are reading up in the industry to see what can be done and would have been invited to events and have seen webinars, and they will have an idea of what the art of the possible is. So, yeah, I absolutely agree. Get involved up front.
If you're going to do the best job you can for your business, you need to involve the business, from the usual suspects around, procurement, IT specialists, maybe contact center analysts, but agents, supervisors, team leaders, C-suite, line of business type people who are not necessarily interested in the day-to-day running of their customer engagement operations, but they're certainly interested in what goes in and what comes out from a business perspective, from a revenue perspective, from a business outcomes perspective. So I think that's not always easy to do, but if you can get a broad engagement and a broad interest early on, maybe before that becomes formalized and people are aware of the art of the possible and rough landscape of vendors, then it will help you to have that internal dialogue when it comes to discovery and creating that RFP process.
Yeah, if the senior exec in the business, that's budget is going to be spent on whatever project you are looking to start, if that person has a number of key metrics that they might need to hit as objectives, then it helps if you actually tell people what those objectives are. Maybe it's a cost-saving metric, maybe it's a productivity metric, how they engage with customers, new routes to market. Say what they are, because that helps.
And also agree what they are. To your story about the supplier who had a row in front of the customer that they were trying to sell to, well, I've seen the flip side of that on a number of occasions. Buyers have come into a presentation and there are the inevitable questions and answers, and I've seen arguments. Well, actually, no, that's not why we're doing this, or that's not the focus. As a seller, you sit there and think, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't look good. What's it going to be like when we start to initiate a project and implement this thing, and we've got 15 different opinions of what good looks like? So get that all sorted out, and the RFP process should help you to do that, to be transparent internally, help you to get things documented, help you to get them to the point where you've got something that you can put out there that gives you a really good platform on which to evaluate objectively what comes back from those sellers. And that brings us on to the next thing. Make sure you are very clear about your criteria and you share it with the people that you're expecting to respond.
People will give you the information to help you evaluate. But if you don't tell them what you're evaluating,
Yep.
Quite often you've got to infer stuff, and at the moment the word inference comes in or guess, then you've got a recipe for disaster. So I think that understanding how you're going to evaluate things and what those must-haves are is absolutely critical. And it's not a secret.
No, it shouldn't be a secret. Neither should how many people you're sending this thing to and what your process is in terms of reducing the number of sellers until you get to the one that you actually want. Because sellers have processes to run through too. When they get RFPs, there's an internal review. They need to know those answers. And sometimes if you haven't got them, then it's an automatic no bid. So being open is a good thing, but there's also confidentiality in this stuff as well. You know, I've worked on RFPs where the actual business objective is to significantly reduce headcount or to close one operation and open it somewhere else. That's not the sort of thing that you really want to be discussing openly. So things like non-disclosure agreement are good things to put in place, maybe before the RFP even goes out of the door, but certainly as part of that process.
On 2 occasions, a separate channel was put in place for senior execs.
Yeah.
Senior execs in the responding organization and senior execs in the buying organization had a role to have a dialogue that was not published in the documentation, so that there was a bit of extra context to go into that environment. And I think do that correctly and it makes everybody's lives easier. On the vein of making lives easier, think about how you want the responses. Because if you give an Excel spreadsheet with 400 lines, and I've seen one recently, of minute technical detail, you know that the people answering that are going to be expert technicians. And they are not looking at what your business context is and what you're trying to achieve.
Right.
They are binary answers that they're crafting, yes or no.
Do you know what? A format that I've seen a few times and I really like is effectively asking the seller organisation, the responders, to mirror the structure of the document that's the RFP. So the RFP will have, you know, an introduction, this is why from an outcome perspective. Can you give us a management summary that demonstrates how you're going to address that? How are you going to get this job done? And then as you go through the different types of questions, and let's face it, Angus, they're quite wide ranging. Yes, there's a lot of stuff about technology and features and functions, but there's also a whole thing around your provenance as a business. Can you actually do this sort of thing? Prove it, references. There's a whole lot of stuff around the legals and the commercials, not just pricing, but the whole structure around contracts and things like ongoing support and sustaining. All of that stuff comes into it. And what I really like to do, it's very easy to respond to, is if you're going through this and you just answer the question as it comes. Maybe the buyer even says, this is what we're looking for here. We don't want your life story here. We just want a couple of lines to describe how you're going to do this or why this is a good idea or why this is a bad idea. Give them a clue, and it will help when it comes to the marking and the evaluation, because you'll have some consistency around this stuff.
Yeah, and if you asking a very open-ended question, which is bad practice, by the way.
Yeah.
At least put a word count limit on it so that the people responding to it have to think about what they're going to say. Because if you put an open question in, you might get war and peace that you've got to then work through. And if you need to do that for tens of responses, you're in for a long timeline.
That's going to be hard work. And also, if you're scoring the thing, tell people how many points they're going to get per answer. Because again, it gives them a clue. It's all about transparency. It's all about openness. If you've got criteria, then share them so everyone knows what they are, and then you've got a much better chance of getting consistency across these responses.
So what about the don'ts? What are the explicit don'ts? Now, don't be negative. These are positive don'ts.
They are, don't get in your own way in a lot of cases. We spoke about don't limit the involvement to the IT and procurement. Now, actually, do you know what? That used to be a massive issue I think in customer engagement business generally, that's improved. I think that there is a lot more involvement from business people and maybe even C-suite people, because customer engagement's a really important thing. So everyone's interested in it.
Last 4 years, customer experience has come to the top of pile.
Yeah.
So I think that's less of a problem, but don't let procurement dictate the actual minutiae of the process. Look at what works and take what
and again,
works.
I'll go back to public sector. I've been involved in a number of RFPs, and the structure and the process is literally the same that they used to buy wheelie bins. It doesn't work. So there needs to be adaptability, there needs to be flexibility. And if you can't do it internally, then get advice. And we touched on consultants last time. There are good consultants out there that can do the job and advice.
The other thing, and you said it earlier, people that are responding to RFPs will have got long memories. They know what you do and what you've done previously. So don't use an RFP to market scan.
Right.
Because people will pick up the fact that you are just putting out these massive requests for information that take a long time to respond to, and you do nothing. And if you do that, you're going to get a very swift no bid. Thank you. I can't be bothered because I don't know whether you're real or not.
Don't give sellers unrealistic timescales. If for no other reason, it gets interpreted that you've already selected someone else. If you give somebody 2 weeks to respond to a big document, most sellers will think, well, they've already made this decision. We're going through the motions here. This is a 3-quote exercise. We're too busy. We've got other things to do.
Sellers know that this is a thing in RFPs. The procurement will say you have to have 3 responses to do that from credible bidders. And if you've already picked one, everybody else looks at it and goes, I don't think I'm going to do this just so that you can tick a box in procurement. Thank you.
The timing of these things is important as well. Don't send out RFPs a couple of days before Christmas and give people 3 weeks to respond. It doesn't work. It's not going to give you the best result, and sellers really don't like it. It's demotivating. You'll limit your responses.
So I would say if you're going to do that, if you're going to issue an RFP over a holiday period, extend the time that people have got to respond, because people might read it. There will be somebody working over a holiday period. There always is, but extend the time. That's one way of mitigating it. We've talked about don't do big open questions. There is absolutely a place for big open questions, but at the same time, be very prescriptive if you do choose to do that.
If you use lots of big open questions, you're going to get lots of big open answers, and that gives sellers an opportunity to interpret and maybe drive potential inaccuracy. And again, let's be clear, a lot of sellers take the view with RFPs that they're questions to answer to get through to the next round. And some of them are a little bit fast and loose with the facts.
That's a very diplomatic way of framing it, Pete.
So there are 2 other points I just want to bring up. Don't assume that everyone you send an RFP to will respond. And the way to make sure that you know what's going on the other side is to stay in touch, solicit feedback, keep people informed of what's going on. And if you do get feedback, act on it quickly. The second point I wanted to make was, do not underestimate as a buyer the amount of time it will take to evaluate the responses. And if you miss deadlines, be open and honest about it, and let sellers know. There's nothing more demotivating or negative from a seller's perspective to see a buyer go quiet. I've always said to salespeople, if they're not talking to you, they're talking to someone else. So the natural assumption is if it all goes quiet, well, we're out of this. Communication is king in these things.
Yeah, remember that if you send it to everybody in the market, you might get 30 responses that you're not expecting, and you owe it to those sellers to evaluate their responses, which means your timeline could be blown out the water even before you've evaluated one.
I loved your story in the last episode about the buyer who unexpectedly has 30 responses on the desktop. What are we going to do with this?
The unlucky sellers.
I'm gonna randomly go through these RFPs and I'm going to throw half of them in the bin because they're unlucky and I don't want to deal with unlucky people. That's a way of doing it. I'm not sure it's a great way of doing it. What if you were going to summarise a nice little takeaway list?
I think the first one, going back to context, say why you're doing the RFP. Provide that context. Don't just ask for the stuff you want. I think that's really important.
Think about who you must involve and actually who it would be useful and maybe nice to involve in the RFP process. The broader the skill set in an RFP, the better.
But also, the more stakeholders that you've got involved, the more likely they are going to support the end decision.
Right. That's a really good point, because I've seen C-suite people upset a project because they weren't involved in it. And I've also seen agents sabotage the hell out of a new solution because they weren't involved in it and they weren't given the opportunity to buy into it.
Only send your RFP to sellers who have a genuine chance of winning.
In doing that, be open about your criteria. If you don't want to deal with businesses that are less than 50 people, if you don't want to deal with people that have got less than a certain turnover, or maybe even more than a certain turnover, or aren't in specific locations, it's okay to say, don't waste people's time.
Always remember, the more specific the question, the more specific the answer that you're going to get back. And that makes your life easy. And maintain that dialogue and make sure that people are asking questions if they're unsure, and help them with open and transparent answers. If you're trying to trick people, you're doing it wrong.
Once you've completed your RFP process, whatever happens, give bidders honest feedback. Have another meeting with them and tell them how they did. And you never know. You might just get to a position where the person you selected didn't quite do it for you, and you've got to go out there and start talking to the same people again. Make sure your bridges aren't on fire when you do that.
I've seen that, but the company that came second 6 months later is the one putting in the solution because the first one fell on its face.
Right.
The most important takeaway from this whole episode, I would say, is that if you happen to be a seller listening to this, go and tell everybody that you know who is a buyer to listen to this episode.
Absolutely, they should do that. So, Angus, we're going to be back next time with episode 7, which is going to be part 3 of the RFP process. In the meantime, follow the Angus and Pete Show on our LinkedIn page for news, notifications, messages. Message us directly. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you want to talk about. Tell us how we're doing, and keep our post bag bulging.
The show's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. So please listen, like, subscribe, and share this to help us spread the word. Before we go, Pete, it's Joke of the Week time.
Oh, it's that time again, isn't it? It's Joke of the Week time. Well, this time I've actually got a purchasing manager joke.
Okay, this is going to be worse than an RFP joke.
No, this is a good joke. Why did the purchasing manager take a duck to work?
Go.
To help him quack the best deals.
Okay. Right, I'm running out of things to say just to express how bad these are.
Say nothing, Angus. Cheers, Angus.
Cheers, Pete.
Thanks for tuning in to the Angus and Pete Show. Remember, it's based on the personal views and opinions of the hosts and their guests. If you're feeling aggrieved or litigious, take a chill pill. There's already enough stress in the world. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform for more episodes. We'll see you next time. Oh, and tell your friends.